Which temples are your favorite?
Well, I think my favorite temple is the Salt Lake Temple. That's where I received my endowment when I was a missionary. We went to the temple in Salt Lake City twice. And then when I got to Scotland in September, the following month in October, we went to the London Temple. London Temple is pretty special. I've been there 3 different times. I've done 12 sessions in the London Temple, and it's in a beautiful area. But I've listed Salt Lake Temple as my favorite, Timpanogos, Washington, D.C., and St. George in that order. Although I have to admit, I like just about every temple I've ever been to, so no complaints on my part. Okay, my next story is I have two stories that hopefully Peyton can put back to back, and I would call these a near-death experience. When I finished my master's degree in 1975, in the summertime, all I had to do was get a job and make a few extra bucks. The senior high councilman on our high council was a guy named Calvin Galloway. I found out just recently, and today is November 9th, that Calvin had passed away this past year. He's like 91 years old. But Calvin and his boys owned a little Jippo logging business. And so I got a job sawing logs for them in the summertime, and then for another fellow driving a logging truck. As I would have this logging truck full of these big timbers. I would come down this one hill, and then as we would turn down at the bottom, it had a sharp turn, and then it was immediately uphill. And so Calvin and his boys were always calling me a chicken, saying I would drive down there too slowly, and then I'd have to gear. It had 24 forward gears in it with a Browning, and so you had two gear shifts that you were shifting. And so then I'd have to put it in first gear and crawl up this big hill. So every day as I would come down the hill, I would go a little faster and a little faster and a little faster, and then I'd always chicken out and slam on the brakes and go around slow. So this one day, I said, okay, today I'm going to do it. So I came burning down this hill. Instead of slowing down, I just figured I'd crank right around there and go up that hill. Problem was I was going just a little bit too fast. And I was driving a Big Mac diesel truck with all these logs on the back. And that truck came down. We went around. It started to tip, and it tipped over sideways. Broke the chokers off, which are steel beams that go up and hold the logs on. They just blew off. The logs went flying out through the woods. And the truck comes skidding to a stop on its side. I had to crawl out the window on the right side. It put the truck out of business for a while, for a couple of weeks before they could get it fixed. And I felt terrible about that. The lesson I learned, though, was when I called Bob Christensen. He was the guy, he was also on our high council, and he's the one that owned the logging truck. I sent word. I can't remember how I sent word down to Kalispell for him to find out, but it took a couple hours for him to get up in the mountains. I made up every excuse I could think of, like a buffalo ran across the road and I had to slam on the brakes and cause me to tip over. I made up all kinds of excuses. What happened? Finally, I just had to fess up to what really happened. But the thing that I learned from Bob Christensen was when he got there, and he's out of business. His truck is tipped over. The logs are all over the place. And he walked up to me. Instead of yelling at me and cussing me, he put his arms around me. He put his arms around me, and we went cheek to cheek, and he said, "Are you okay?" I thought that was one of the greatest lessons I've ever learned.
What earthly person helped shape your faith the most?
I've been blessed with a lot of good people around me, a lot of good mentors, from school teachers to scoutmaster to just ward members, people that don't even know they've been a good example. So I've thought about us. I'll just pick a guy that probably none of you of my children have ever heard of. His name is Don Ludlow. And Don Ludlow owns Dolphin Pools in Salt Lake City, and Don is he's probably pushing 90s. I think he's maybe 10 years older than me. But when he was a young kid, his dad owned the AG store, grocery store just down the street. And he was getting his swimming pools underway. And so he would come up there on Thursday night after the store hours and mop the floor and, scrape the gum off the floor and mop and wax the floors. So we used to go down there as kids, knock on the window on the door, and he'd let us in. And then it was just a good guy that loved kids, and we could talk and visit with him, and we could talk talk to him about anything, about dating, about girls, about sex, about going on missions, just stuff that you don't necessarily want to talk to your folks about. But he was open and he was honest and he was a good, faithful Latter-day Saint. Later on, I ran into Don, later in my life when I was a bishop, I used to come down to General Conference, and he was one of the guys working in the tabernacle that would help squish people in and help them get seated. Just a sweet, sweet, sweet guy. I was teaching seminary, early morning seminary, and I had to go to Polson this morning. My choice was to go down the right side of Flathead Lake or down the left side. And so for some reason this morning I decided to go down the left side. It was the same distance, but the road on the left side was a little less traveled and I think maybe even a little bit more narrow. It was still dark. It was like 6 o'clock or 5:30 in the morning, and coming towards me was a logging truck. So I was driving my little Volkswagen with both hands and making sure I was over to the right as far as I could get to make sure that, everything was fine. But as this logging truck came past me, a log fell off, although it wasn't a log that big around. It was a log about that big around, probably more of a branch, came off and hit the windshield of my car. I didn't see it coming. I'm just driving, and all of a sudden, pow. And it not only hit the windshield, but it really hit the top of the car. It hit right there where the metal was. Caved it in. The glass turned into powder. And if it wouldn't been for my glasses, I probably would have been blind because I didn't see anything coming. I didn't hear it coming. It would just pow. And all of a sudden, my face was covered with glass that was just powdered glass. I was almost to Polson, so I managed to stop, realized that I was okay. I drove into Polson, trying not to blink my eyes or anything, pulled into a service station and got their vacuum and vacuumed my face and my hair, everything off of me the best I could. Then I went over to my seminary class, which I was late for. I said, "You guys won't believe this, come out here." And so we went out and looked at my Volkswagen, and the whole windshield and everything was just caved in. So then I drove back on the west side of the lake, back to Kalispell, decided to report this to the newspaper. So I went down to the newspaper, said, "Come out and take a picture of my car," and I told them what happened. They weren't impressed at all. I thought for sure they'd want to take a picture and put me in the newspaper, but they didn't. Then I went home and reported to Carolyn, and as I remember, Shannon was about 6 years old, 5 or 6 years old, and so she spent the rest of the morning picking glass out of my hair. Quite an experience. I'm grateful to be alive.